Welcome to Conversations. I'm Muqtedar Khan, your host. And this particular conversation is more for my students who are students of politics of development. So, this is primarily a basic introduction to development class in the politics of development. But I decided that I will make it public for those students in other parts of the world who are interested in development, and my other colleagues who teach development. If they want, they can use this video as a supplement. Don't consider this as the primary source for all that you want to know about development. So you can use this as a supplement to various readings and books that you're using in your class. This is designed as the first lecture on politics of development after discussion of the course syllabus. So let's begin by first talking about what is development. Development is one of the biggest issues in world politics today for most countries, in fact, for all countries. One of the national purposes is to develop. So what do you mean by develop? We try to develop the infrastructure of the countries, we try to develop the well-being of the population. So everything that a country does to improve the quality of life of its citizens is what development is all about. So it refers to the process of improving the quality of life, the economic well-being, and the political well-being of society. It includes economic growth, social progress, political freedoms, human capabilities, giving everybody an opportunity to become the best versions of themselves. For peace citizens, if they want to pursue happiness, they can pursue happiness, they can pursue prosperity. So the idea is essentially that you try to create a country and develop it along political and economic lines so that the citizens have the best opportunity to live a fulfilled and meaningful life. But there is also clear undertones of development, political underdevelopment, and also in many ways transnational overtones, because we divide the world into essentially developed and developing. In the past, during the Cold War, the world was divided into First World, Second World, and Third World. So recently there was controversy in the United States where President Trump referred to certain countries as third world countries. So essentially, the First World were countries associated with NATO and Northern Western Europe and North America. Those countries which are aligned with the US against the Soviet Union were labeled as First World countries, countries which were part of the Soviet Union and its influence and its sphere of influence, or the Warsaw Pact countries, were considered as Second World. These were countries which were more or less developed, like Russia, the current Ukraine, Poland, and others, which are more developed than post-colonial societies, and we'll talk about that shortly, but were aligned with the Soviet Union or were part of the communist bloc that they were called the Second World, and all the countries which were not part of either the US or the Soviet Union, which were led by certain countries, which were also referred to as non-aligned countries, led by leaders from like Pandit Nehru from India, Nasser in Egypt. We have Tito in Yugoslavia, Sukarno in Indonesia. So these were the countries which were non-aligned. They created a non-aligned movement of over 100 countries, and they were referred to as the third world countries. So third world was a political term, essentially said you were neither aligned with the US nor with the Soviet Union, but it also had these implications that you were not exactly a developed country. So eventually we started talking about them as developed countries which were in the north. So most Western countries, Australia, even some of the Soviet Union bloc were considered as developed. And then we talked about underdeveloped countries, which were essentially part of the colonial world. So the Europe had colonized many parts of Asia and Africa. They had exploited them for their resources. And then eventually, after Second World War, many of these countries gained their independence. Most of them are Asian and African countries. And basically, they were ravaged, and basically, European countries killed large number of people in these continents, stole their natural resources from Latin America, from Africa, and from Asia, silver and gold, from very well known from South America, diamonds and other minerals from Africa, and even from India. In fact, two of the most prominent diamonds in the world, the Kohinoor and Hope diamond, come from my hometown in Hyderabad, from the Golconda gold mines. In fact, I say that Hyderabad has provided three diamonds to the world: the Kohinoor, the Hope, and Muqtedar Khan. So there are moments when I'm not very humble. So anyway, so these countries which were colonized were literally systematically robbed by European countries for decades. According to some calculations, the British who controlled India for over 190 years, from 1757 to 1947, basically stole $45 trillion worth of resources. Not only did they rob these countries of their natural resources, but they left a cultural imprint. For some, it became advantageous because these countries could speak English and were connected to the first world. But they also left enduring problems associated with borders, with underdevelopment, with ethnic and religious conflicts. South Asia is one of the best examples of the consequences of colonialism and divided borders, religious animosity, national animosities, etc. So that is what we call as a condition of underdevelopment, which is as a consequence of exploitation by European powers or Western powers. And unfortunately, I must say that these post-colonial societies are today, for political correctness purposes, described as developing because they have all improved significantly after they became independent. The most remarkable examples of development are East Asian tigers like Hong Kong and Singapore and South Korea, and Taiwan, but also Japan. But Japan was also an imperial power, so it doesn't fall into the post-colonial society. But India and China are the best examples of developing countries which have become very successful after they became independent. So we think of development essentially in three categories. So economic growth. So the economic point of view of development is sustained development and income growth. So you measure that in per capita GDP. That is the main instrument. And then you have the human point of view, where you look at not just the income, but you also look at other aspects of society, which is, do people have freedom? Do people have choices? Can they follow whatever religion they want? Do they have the opportunity to become a doctor if you want to become a doctor? If you're a woman, if you want to become a professor, can that happen to you? Today in Afghanistan, women cannot go to school beyond the 6th grade. So that tells you that there is a certain kind of underdevelopment that is being imposed by the current government of that country. So we measure that development not in terms of income, but in terms of opportunities. And then, of course, there are social aspects of looking at it, of poverty, inequality, unemployment, young people who are highly educated and therefore have benefited from development, but are unemployed because their national economy is not doing well. There are broadly two theories that address development. One is called the modernization theory, which talks about why countries have developed. Like, why did the West become so rich and powerful? It kind of ignores the benefits from imperialism and colonialism, but talks about how certain changes in society, the Protestant work ethic, for example, Marx Weber talks about how it moved people away from superstitious beliefs to becoming more materialistic in the world, thinking that if you work hard and you educate yourself, you can do well. So there are these reforms that have taken place in Western societies, which is broadly described as modernization, moving away from religiosity and becoming more secular, focusing more on material development, becoming more democratic, and also focusing essentially more and more on scientific way of thinking and scientific development, leading to industrialization, the information age, and so on and so forth. So, for example, we are currently experiencing another set of an era in history with a sudden spike in growth and development, which is through artificial intelligence. And countries which adapt to this and societies that adapt to this will become richer and more powerful, and societies which eschew this will become less developed and behind. So the modernization theory identifies the early modernization theory talked about how countries went from being traditional to modern and therefore became rich and powerful. And then later on, we started talking about in terms of globalization. So countries which adapted to globalization, the latest version of modernization, like India and China, and the Asian tigers that I talked about, they have become richer and more developed. And those which did not adjust to globalization have fallen behind. And one example would be Pakistan, for example. Then the other approach is the theory of, it's called it as various ways, the world systems theory or theories of underdevelopment, which argue that, well, the world is divided in two kinds of powers, those who exploit and those who have been exploited. And so they point to imperialism and colonialism and argue that there was a systematic destruction of societies. So if you go back, say, a couple of 100 years ago, you'll find that the richest countries in the world were China and India. They had the greatest share of the global GDP, even 50%. There was a point where India, under the Mughals, had 27% of the global GDP, which is roughly what the US has today. So the amount of rich and economic prosperity that America enjoys today, that is what Indians were enjoying under the Mughal Empire. So we talk about those, that how did then India, which at one point had 27% share of the global GDP, today has less 4%. It's about 3.5% of the global GDP, in spite of the fact that it is now the fourth or the fifth biggest economy in the world and the fastest growing major economy. It still has only 3 or 4% of the share. So how did it become 1/8 of what it used to be? Well, that is because of colonialism and imperialism and exploitation by Great Britain and Western powers. And therefore, we can understand development or lack of development in the global South as a consequence of systematic exploitation. So there is another way of understanding why some countries are developed and why they are not. We will talk about those theories during the course of this semester, and I will also share readings for you. So what are the key features of underdeveloped countries? The opposite would be true for developed countries. So one example way in which we identify or the defining characteristics of underdeveloped countries is low per capita income. So if, say, that you have a country with 10 people in it, and if the total economy or total stuff that is produced and traded, etc., the total income and production of that country is, say, 100, then total of economy divided by total population, it gives you the per capita income. In this case, it would be $10. And if there's another country where there are only 5 people, but its economy is also 100, then its per capita income would be 20. So we would say, oh, this is a richer country than the other. This is more developed than the other. So one indicator is per capita income. For underdeveloped countries, the per capita income would be low. For developed countries, it will be high. So for example, if you take a country like, say, Pakistan, its per capita income right now is around $1,500. If you take India, it's $2,800. If you take Bangladesh, these are all South Asian countries, it would be $2,600-$700. These are compared to, say, Germany, its per capita income is $55,000. So you can see right away that, oh my God, there's a huge difference in the economy. The US is around $90,000, $89,000 is US per capita income. So if you take, say, Bangladesh at 2,800 and the US at 89,000, you can see the difference between the per capita income and guess the degree of development. They have more money to spend on schools, more money to spend on infrastructure, more money to spend on healthcare, on defense, on weapons, and so on and so forth. So one good indicator would be per capita income. Another indication is that underdeveloped countries have high degrees of poverty and unemployment. So, for example, India and China have done a tremendous job in the last 30 years to lift about 1.2 billion people out of extreme poverty. So India has lifted about 450 million people. China has lifted about 800 million people out of absolute poverty, but there are still millions of people who are living in poor conditions, which are living on less than $2 a day or living on. So, for example, an average salary in India is about 25,000 rupees, which is about $300. So they are living on $10 a day. This is an average, lower middle income. So the poor people make far less. They make like 6,000 to 8,000 rupees a month. If you are making $300 per month in India, you are in the top half of the country. That means half your countrymen are making less than you. In the US, the median income is over $60,000. So poverty is one, unemployment is another, because the economies are weak, there's high unemployment. And then low industrialization, that is another sign, and poor health care, which is measured in terms of lower life expectancy, and education in terms of how many people go to schools, how many people go to colleges, etc. So these are all indications of development. So underdeveloped countries have low per capita income, high poverty and unemployment, low industrialization, poor healthcare and educational standards. So the developed countries are more or less the opposite. They have high per capita income, low poverty, low unemployment, high degrees of industrialization, poor healthcare and good healthcare and good education. But we also have a peculiar situation now that even highly developed countries are becoming less and less industrial, such as England. So England is perhaps the most deindustrialized advanced economy. So it is still the fifth or sixth biggest economy in the world. It has roughly 60 million people, but its per capita income is over $45,000. But 80% of its economy comes from services, education, consulting, finances, etc. That means they're completely deindustrialized. They don't make anything. Some comes from agriculture, some come from trade, and the rest comes from services. So low industrialization can be an indicator of poor countries or very advanced economies, like the US is nearly 77% come from. The US is a very interesting country. For example, the US, only 10% of the US economy has manufacturing or industrial output, and over 75% or more is services. But because the US is also the biggest economy in the world at $31 trillion, 10% of $31 trillion is $3.1 trillion. So the manufacturing output or the industrial output of India, of the US, is 80% of the Indian economy, or very close to the size of the British economy. And it is the second biggest producer or manufacturer after China. So yes, low industrialization in percentage, but in terms of production, very high. But these are the four broad indicators that you should keep in mind. So let's now talk about politics of developing nations. So we leave developed world with their ethno-nationalism and rise of populism, etc. aside. We'll talk about, this class is about the politics of developing nations. So now that we know what are developing nations are those which were underdeveloped, and they are getting better and better. Once I show you World Bank indications, what the World Bank's criteria are, you will begin to understand a bit more clearly what are developing nations. So let me give you an example. Last year, I went to India. In January, I spent a whole month in India after like more than 25 years abroad. So I got to see India, the fastest growing major economy, the fourth biggest or fifth biggest economy at that time. So I saw people who are very wealthy. There are many billionaires. India produces the third largest number of billionaires, but its per capita income is just $2,800. So it is amazing. The US is maybe 30 times richer than India. And I could see poverty everywhere. I could see prosperity everywhere. And then after that, at the end of that year, I went to Brazil. And I could see the difference between these are both middle income economies according to World Bank, but one is a lower middle income and one is an upper middle income. So in a few months, I went to India, went to Brazil, went to Spain and spent 2 weeks in Spain. And I was able to see very clearly, you can just see that when you walk out in the street that, oh, this is a lower middle income. This is an upper middle income, and this is a high income economy, which is what Spain is. So you can see the developed nature of society right there. It stands right there in your face. You may miss the political development side of it, but the economic development side of it is everywhere. You can see that on the airport. You can see that in restaurants. You can see that on the roads, in traffic, on the quality of cars, etc. Anyway, so we are just focusing on the politics that agitates the developed nations who are now independent from their colonial past and are struggling. So these are the four characteristics of the politics of developing nations, that they have a colonial legacy and dependency. So they are post-colonial societies. So they have very peculiar politics. We will try to flush it out as much as we can. So for example, the Indian elite speaks English. They read, like I grew up reading P.G. Wodehouse, which most Americans will not understand, but all Brits will know that this is what the British elite students in schools will read. We are very familiar with British poetry, British music. We play all of British sports. We learn soccer from the Brits. We learn cricket from the Brits. India is passionately crazy about cricket. It is a colonial legacy. But there are also negative consequences. We think that people who are of lighter skin are better than people who are of darker skin. This is just one cultural consequence of living in a post-structural society. But there are lots of impacts of colonial legacy, which, for example, the Indian entire system of government is exact replica of the British system. It's called the Westminster model of democracy. And while we did copy the British US federalism, our parliamentary system of government is a replica of the British, except that instead of the king, we have a president. Then in politics, in developing nations, some of their institutions are weak. The judiciaries are weak. Freedom of press is curtailed. So political institutions, even the parliamentary systems tend to be weak. And you can see them in developing countries. And the third aspect is that the elite dominates and there is corruption. Right now, you saw protests in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, in Nepal, and other, and also in some Eastern European countries, what we call as a Gen Z, like young people protesting because there is nepotism going on. So yes, so one aspect of developing societies is because their institutions are weak, there are corruptions. So you will find that the anti-corruption police chief is probably one of the most corrupt people in the country. So that is what happens. So if you have strong institutions, strong judiciary, strong media, strong law enforcement agencies, then the corruption goes down. And then in developing countries, we see that the government plays a bigger role in economic strategies, etc., unlike developed societies, which are a more laissez-faire. What are the challenges of developing countries? The challenges that developing countries face is political instability. Today, I recorded a show about political instability in Bangladesh. There is rioting in the streets, minorities are being lynched and killed. There are protests against India, protests against the current government. Public is unhappy. They feel that the ruling elite are delaying elections, so there's lack of legitimacy of the government. All of this are aspects of political instability. There will be violence in the streets, and so on and so forth. That's one characteristic of developing nations. And if you tell me that the same thing is happening in the United States, well, then it shows that the US is becoming underdeveloped. There are ethnic and social divisions. Suddenly, we have huge problems of ethnic and social divisions. These are fault lines in the societies, and they have political and economic implications. Most of the developing nations have a debt crisis, even though the biggest debtor is the most developed of countries, which is the United States. Everything about the US is a peculiar, and it kind of undermines all theory, the US, but more developing nations are borrowing money to develop from mostly developed countries or from multilateral institutions. And they are always under economic pressures because of trade battles or geopolitical tensions. So let's go to the World Bank. We'll talk about the World Bank and international institutions in a different section or different lecture. But assume there is a World Bank out there which gives loans to countries so that they can invest in their development. So the World Bank classifies the world into 4 types of countries. They say the countries that are low income, lower middle income, upper middle income, and high income countries. So if you look at this particular map here, the dark green ones are the developed high income economies, which means their per capita income is a little more than $4,500. That number changes every year because of inflation, etc. So last year, in 2025, the high income economy is the one which has per capita income of $14,000. So if you look at countries like China, for example, with all the fact that it's the second biggest economy in the world and major superpower, it is not a high income economy because it has a huge population and its per capita income is less than 14,000. It's around 13,500, or maybe it might cross over this year. So China is not a high income economy, but if you look at most of Western Europe, Northern America, Australia, Russia, and some Gulf oil-rich countries, these are the high-income economies. Their per capita incomes are more than 14,000. And then there are really poor countries, as you can see. They are the sub-Saharan countries, mostly in Africa. And then you have Afghanistan in South Asia. And then Syria is also shown as a low-income economy. So a low-income economy is where there's a lot of poverty, like the per capita income is less than $1,200 or $1,145. That's the benchmark for 2025 that World Bank has. So these are the extremes. And you can see that roughly 15 times is the difference. So a minimum high-income economy, like Turkey just became a high-income economy. And it is 15 times richer than, say, Afghanistan. And then you have in the middle, they divided the middle income economies into lower middle income and upper middle income. So if you look at South Asia, most of South Asia is lower middle income because their per capita income is less than 4,500. So that is the cutoff, $4,500. If your per capita income is $4,500, more than that, and less than 14,000, then you're upper middle income. So an examples of upper middle income is most of Latin America or South America. If you look at it, at the color coding of South America, you can see it is most of the countries have a per capita income above 4,500 and below 14,000. I had visited Brazil and I talked about it. And Brazil is about $10,000 per capita income. And then South Asia, you can see the light green is lower middle income. So you can see that development is kind of clustered in regions. So it's not just a country becoming rich. The region also has to become. So it is very rarely that you will find a country which is very rich surrounded by very poor countries. You can see that in Saudi Arabia and Yemen, because Saudi Arabia has oil and Yemen does not. This is also another map which gives you an idea of countries which are developed and countries which are developing. This map is a little interesting. This was a couple of years old, and so it places most of Central Asia, Russia, Eastern European countries as developing nations. Even Ukraine, for example, which is an upper middle income economy, and describe them as developing, and very few, like Western Europe, North America, and Australia, as developed countries. So this is another characterization of those countries. So the World Bank, which divided the world into low income, lower middle income, upper middle income, and higher income economies, have come up with a strategy called the 3I strategy. So when I ask you to write a paper about or a development strategy for a country, I want you to use this model from the World Bank to discuss how it is. You can obviously reject it and say, oh, this doesn't make sense. But you must have a good argument as to why it does not make sense. And you can then come up with your own model. Maybe we can send that to the World Bank and they will learn something from you. Anyway, so this is what the World Bank says, the 3I strategy. The first I is for investment, the second I is for infusion of technology, and the third one is for innovation. So this is what they say, that if you want to move, if you're a low-income country, like Afghanistan, like Somalia, like the sub-Saharan countries that we saw in Africa, in the middle part of Africa, all the yellow part. If you are that country, low-income economy, that means your GDP per capita is less than $1,145 in 2025, then you must invest, which means you borrow money or you have your own national. Invest in what? Invest in education, invest in infrastructure, invest in creating an environment where people can then work towards and earn a living and create jobs and achieve a higher income level. So the first criteria for a country to say become independent, like South Sudan just became independent from Sudan, it is a low-income economy. So what should you do if you are the president? You focus on investment. And what do you invest in? Infrastructure, build roads, make sure everybody has telephones, make sure there are hospitals, make sure there are universities, and you educate your population. And so you invest in fighting poverty, invest in agriculture, in healthcare. So it's about investing in basically infrastructure. That is the first strategy for countries which are, once you become a lower middle income economy, which means that your per capita now exceeds $1,200 per year, then you go into what is called investment plus infusion. So you continue to invest, but now you start looking at the world and say, oh, what is the world doing? Oh my God, United Arab Emirates has made sure that all its citizens have access to the professional version of ChatGPT for free. Well, you can't do that if you're a poor country, but you can say, okay, we need to improve the digitization of our economy. What is the world doing? They're going into AI, they're going into digital technology. So we try to bring in the technologies which are out there in the world and make sure that they spread. Let more and more people have access to the internet. Let more and more people use the digital infrastructure of the world to this. Let your students have access to Wi-Fi, have access to the internet, have access to the knowledge bases, have access to Khan Academy in YouTube or Wikipedia or whatever. So try to bring in technologies from outside and infuse them. Let people have smartphones, but in order to have smartphones, you have to have a widespread infrastructure and networks, 5G and so on and so forth. So you bring in technologies and invest in that. That's where you spend your money. If you're an lower middle income economy, like you have built enough roads and you have built enough schools and you've built enough hospitals. The next step is to try and bring in technologies. You have a hospital, bring in the best medical technology that is available. You have a school, make sure that they have access to the internet. You have roads, well, try to make them smart, and so on and so forth. And then they have the third eye, which is if you are an upper middle income economy, like Brazil. An example of a lower middle income economy is India. But if you are an upper middle income economy, then you start infusing in innovation. So rather than just adapting the innovation that is being practiced in rich and developed countries, you try to become innovative. And that will make you an upper or higher income economy. Innovation in every aspect of society. Your education system is innovative. Your technology is innovative. You're competing now. And that is the recommendation. So the upper income or developed societies have higher degree of infusion of innovation in the technologies and stuff. So for example, when I go and teach a class here, everybody has at least one or two digital, everyone has an iPhone right there or a smartphone sitting on their desk, but they also have, all of them have latest laptops. Occasionally, I will see some people using a tablet, but everybody seems to have the state-of-the-art technology. They have Wi-Fi, they have access to the internet. And so you can see that they are working together now. Everybody is becoming literate in AI-related agents that are available. Everyone is using ChatGPT to do their research and so on and so forth. So in an upper income economy, you will see a large number of people who are using technology quite a bit. And then the technology has diffused itself. Innovation is very common everywhere. So this is the classification and the strategies. So if you're low income, you invest in infrastructure. If you're lower middle income, you invest in infrastructure, but you start bringing in the technologies which are already out there in developed societies. If you're a middle income economy, you start investing in innovation to become a high income economy. High income economies, well, you keep doing what you're doing. You seem to be okay. So you can measure development either in terms of economic measures, such as GDP per capita. So take, for example, the United Arab Emirates or Qatar or Saudi Arabia. They have very high quality of life and very high GDPs. But there's something missing there, which is absence of democratic governance. They're monarchies. Whereas if you look at Northern Europe, like Scandinavian countries, Norway, etc., they also have monarchies, but they have democracies too. So we argue that, yes, Saudi Arabia is economically developed, but politically underdeveloped because it has not democratized. So there is this assumption that the more you become democratic, the more freedoms that are available to your population, the more politically developed you are. So political development is just another way of measuring democratization. But there are societies which are high income, but which are not fully democratic, but people seem to be very happy, like Singapore, for example. Hong Kong, I was in Hong Kong very recently. I've been to Singapore on several occasions, and yeah, people seem to be very happy. So they are not democratic societies, so what do we make of it? How do we understand the level of development? So there is another indicator called the Human Development Index, which looks at several things and says basically that just GDP per capita is not the only way. So for example, if you look at a country which may have, say, high income, like for example, Russia. But I think people in India with a lower per capita income are better off than people who are just living in Russia with higher income because of various criteria. So two people, one Pakistani and one Indian economist, developed an indicator called Human Development Index, HDI. And so they use health life expectancy at birth, education, years of schooling, and income to argue that HDI is a better indicator of what the quality of life is. Because if you have money but no education, then you don't have a good quality of life. So if you have education and money but don't have good health care, then you don't have good. So development here is measured, but it is apolitical, so it doesn't give any point for living in a democratic society. So HDI is a slightly better indicator than just GDP per capita. And there are rankings available. And it matters because it goes beyond income, it focuses on human well-being, and is useful for policy comparisons. So if you want to understand which country you want to copy, I would recommend that you go to countries which are ranked higher on HDI and not just on. So for example, if you take the United States and certain Northern European countries, the US has higher per capita income than say Norway or Sweden or Finland. But these countries, people are happier and they have higher human development index ranking than the US, even though all of these countries are more or less democratic. So that is what we will talk about. So what are the politics of the developing nations? What are the indications of measurement? And so in this module, there are several articles that I have attached. And in this particular, in 2026 January, I will be using an Indian television series called Panchayat to give you a extremely local, granular, local level exposure to politics in a developing country. So thank you for watching. And those of you who are not in my class but have watched this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, press the bell icon for future indications or notifications for future videos, and of course, share it with your other colleagues. Thank you for watching.